Part 1. Introduction. The shadows between the verses. Imagine, for a moment, the flickering light of an oil lamp in a small, dusty room in Jerusalem, perhaps 500 years before Christ. A scribe sits hunched over a piece of parchment, the smell of sheepskin and ink filling the air. His hand hovers over the scroll. He knows the stories of his ancestors, the songs sung around campfires in the desert, the terrifying myths whispered by the Babylonians in the east and the Canaanites in the west. He knows them all. But as he dips his reed into the ink to write the opening words of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, he makes a choice. He chooses what to include, but more importantly, he chooses what to leave out. We often view the Bible as a monolithic stone, descended from heaven fully formed. We trace the letters with our fingers, believing every silence in the text is merely a pause for breath. But what if the silence is hiding something? What if the white space between the verses contains the ghosts of stories that were suppressed, edited, or deliberately erased? When we read Genesis today, we see a majestic, orderly poem of creation. God speaks, and it is so. But look closer at the edges of the narrative. There are scars in the text. There are strange grammatical anomalies, abrupt transitions, and echoes of a violent cosmic war that the final editors tried to hush. Tonight, we are not just reading what is written, we are reading what was removed. We are going to light a candle in the dark corners of history to find the lines erased from Genesis, the lost battles, the vanished monsters, and the uncomfortable truths that the ancient scribes wanted us to forget. Part 2. The deep dive into the abyss of the past. A. Historical context. The ocean of myths. To understand what is missing from Genesis, we must first understand the world in which it was born. The ancient Israelites did not live in a vacuum. They were a small people sandwiched between giants, the great empires of Egypt, Babylon, and Canaan. These cultures possessed their own accounts of how the universe began, and they were terrifyingly different from the Genesis we know. In the ancient Near East, creation was never a peaceful act of architecture. It was the result of a bloody war. The Babylonians had the Enuma Elish, a grand epic where the god Marduk battles Tiamat, the chaotic dragon goddess of the Salt Sea. Marduk slays her, splits her corpse in two, and uses her carcass to fashion the heavens and the earth. To the north, the Canaanites told stories of Baal battling Yam, the god of the violent sea, and his monster, Lotan, a twisting, seven-headed serpent. For centuries, these were the dominant explanations for existence. Order is established only by killing chaos through violence. The ancestors of Israel breathed this air. They knew these dragons. Yet, when we open Genesis chapter 1, there is no battle. There is no dragon corpse. There is only a sovereign God, peaceful, obedient creation. However, history tells us that texts evolve. The Torah was not written in a single afternoon. It was curated, compiled, and refined over centuries. Historians and theologians suggest that the final form of Genesis was a polemic, a counter-argument against the pagan world. But to create this sanitized version of monotheism, the scribes had to erase the old myths. They had to take the chaos dragon that terrified the ancient world and remove him from the story. Or at least, they tried to. B. Decoding the scripture. Traces of the sea monster. If we look with a scholar's eye at the Hebrew text, we find that the erasure was not perfect. The fingerprints of the old erased story are still visible in the ink. Consider the very second verse of the Bible. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. In Hebrew, the word for the deep is tehom. To the casual reader, it is just water. But linguistically, tehom is cognate with Tiamat, the Babylonian dragon goddess of chaos. The text does not say God created tehom. The deep is simply there, lurking in the darkness before the first day, a primordial challenge to order. It is a subtle, linguistic remnant of the old enemy. But the evidence of the erased lines becomes overwhelming when we step outside of Genesis and look at other books of the Bible that seem to preserve the older tradition. Genesis maintains a polite silence, but the poets of Israel could not keep the secret. Read the words of the prophet Isaiah. In chapter 51, verse 9, he cries out, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Art thou not it that hath cut Rahab, and wounded the dragon?" Who is Rahab? Not the woman of Jericho, but a mythical sea monster, a parallel to Leviathan. Isaiah is remembering a creation story where God didn't just speak. He fought. He took a sword to the dragon of the sea. Look at Psalm 4-13:1-4, where the psalmist recalls God's ancient deeds. Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces. Here is the missing scene from Genesis 1. These verses preserve the violent tradition that the Genesis scribe deliberately suppressed. In the poetic books, the battle rages on. God crushes heads. He pierces the gliding serpent. But in Genesis, the scribe effectively erased this battle. He demythologized the universe. He took the terrifying Tiamat, stripped her of her personality, her power, and her divinity, and reduced her to mere water, tehom, lifeless matter that waits obediently for God's command. See the hidden theological meaning, the power of silence. Why did they do it? Why erase the epic battle? This is where we find the profound theological genius of the Hebrew scribes. If the Bible had included a story of God fighting a dragon to create the world, it would imply something dangerous. It would imply that the dragon was a rival. If God has to fight to establish order, it means chaos has power. It means God is merely the strongest warrior in the room, but not the absolute sovereign. By erasing the battle, the authors of Genesis were making a radical claim. They were saying that for the God of Israel, there is no struggle. There is no war. The sea monsters, the sun, the moon, the darkness, these are not gods to be fought. They are merely creations. God speaks, and the chaos obeys. The erasure was an act of theology. It replaced the myth of combat with the myth of sovereign word. When Genesis says, "And God created great whales," or sea monsters, in verse 21, it uses the Hebrew word tannanim. In other cultures, the tannin was a god. In Genesis, it is just a creature, listed alongside cattle and creeping things. The scribe effectively neutered the nightmares of the ancient world. He is telling us, do not fear the dark water. Do not fear the monsters of the deep. My God created them, and they are under his leash. The lines were erased not to hide the truth, but to reveal a higher truth, that the darkness we fear is not an equal opposite to the light. D. Controversies and theories. The gap and the watchers. However, the battle of the sea is not the only section that seems to have been pruned. Throughout history, readers have sensed other gaps that suggest missing narratives. One of the most enduring controversies is the gap theory. Between Genesis 1, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," and Genesis 1-2, "And the earth was without form and void," millions of years and a cosmic catastrophe seem to fit. Some mystics and scholars argue that an entire civilization or an angelic age was destroyed here. Perhaps the fall of Lucifer, leaving the earth in a state of tohu wabohu, waste and void. Was there a description of this cataclysm that was removed? Or is the text simply poetic? Furthermore, we must consider the cryptic reference in Genesis 6 to the sons of God marrying the daughters of men and birthing the Nephilim. Genesis gives this event only a few scant verses, almost a passing glance, yet the ancient non-canonical Book of Enoch explodes this into a massive, detailed saga of fallen angels, the Watchers, forbidden knowledge, and genetic corruption. Why is Genesis so brief on this matter? Why are the names of the Watchers and the details of their sin erased or condensed into a footnote? It is likely that the editors of the Torah wanted to avoid glorifying evil. They did not want Israel fixated on the hierarchy of demons or the mythology of semi-divine heroes. They wanted the eyes of the people fixed on the covenant and the law. The rich, dangerous tapestry of folklore was trimmed back to leave only the barest branches necessary to explain the flood. The text we have is a curated garden, but the wild forest is still visible just beyond the fence. Part 3. Conclusion. The echo of the unwritten. As we roll up the scroll and the candle burns low, we are left with a profound realization. The Bible is not just a collection of what was remembered. It is shaped by what was chosen. The lines erased from Genesis, the cosmic battles, the names of the dragons, the histories of the fallen angels, were not lost by accident. They were silenced by design. In their place, the scribes gave us something unique in the history of religion. A God who does not need violence to create, a God who has no rival in the cosmos, and a narrative that focuses not on the wars of the heavens, but on the responsibility of man on earth. Yet, the echoes remain. When we feel the chaos of our own lives, the tohu wabohu of our personal struggles, we are feeling the remnants of that ancient deep. We remember the dragon, but the lesson of the erased lines is this: we do not need to fight the darkness on its own terms. We need only listen for the voice that speaks above the water. The power of Genesis lies not just in the ink on the page, but in the blank spaces where the monsters used to be. It reminds us that some stories are better left untold, so that the one true story, the story of redemption and order, can shine without obstruction. The scribes erased the dragon so that we might see the Creator. And perhaps, in the silence of those missing lines, we find the greatest assurance of all, that the darkness was never a threat to